One rock just made Mars harder to dismiss. That was the problem. It was supposed to do something smaller than that. It was supposed to add detail, add texture, add one more careful line to the scientific picture of an old planet. Instead, it weakened the old picture itself. For years, Mars survived in the public imagination inside one clean, emotionally convenient sentence. Dead planet. Red, empty, ancient, finished. A world interesting enough to explore, but settled enough to keep the audience calm. Curiosity could find one more ridge, one more layer of clay, one more chemical detail, and the larger emotional conclusion would still hold. Mars was mysterious in texture, perhaps, but not in essence. Then one drilled sample started damaging that sentence. That is why this story matters. Not because it proves life. It does not. Because it weakens something older and more comfortable. The simple dead planet story. That is a stronger hook than a proof headline, because proof would end the tension. This finding does the opposite. It leaves the source unresolved while making the chemistry heavier. It leaves the question open while making the old emotional shortcut look thinner. That is exactly where high-retention documentary storytelling lives, not in certainty. In the collapse of lazy certainty, NASA says Curiosity analyzed a mudstone sample called Mary Anning 3 and found the most diverse suite of organic molecules ever identified on Mars. 21 carbon-containing molecules, 7 of them detected there for the first time. NASA also says scientists cannot determine whether those molecules were produced by biologic or geologic processes, while adding that the result strengthens the case that ancient Mars had the right chemistry to support life and that organics can survive in Martian rocks for billions of years. That should have stayed a chemistry story. It didn't, because Mars does not become more compelling when it gives us a final answer. Mars becomes more compelling when it stops cooperating with an old answer people liked too much. And people liked the old answer, dead planet. It is a clean sentence, stable, efficient, emotionally useful. It lets viewers admire the mystery while still feeling the case is basically closed. Mars becomes a beautiful ruin, a red graveyard, a failed Earth. Interesting, yes, but finished. This sample pushes back against that comfort, quietly but hard. There was no spectacular transmission from Mars, no giant announcement that rewrote biology, no dramatic photograph that looked like a confession, just years of careful work. A sample once drilled into powder, chemistry coaxed out of stone, and one cautious official release carrying a dangerous implication. The old summary is now weaker than it used to be. That is the line this whole story turns on. Mars did not come back to life. It became less dismissible. That is colder than a cheap mystery and more powerful than a fake revelation, because once a planet becomes less dismissible, everything around it changes tone. The imagery changes. The silence changes. Even the dust changes. Because now the emptiness is no longer emotionally empty in the same way. Now the viewer is looking at a world that may have preserved more of its chemical story than people were comfortable imagining. And preservation is dangerous to a dead world narrative. Because once a world starts preserving richer chemistry than expected, dead stops sounding like a conclusion and starts sounding like a convenience. That is what this sample did. And the evidence object is perfect. One rock, one drill hole, one contradiction. That is enough to build a whole video around, because the strongest science mysteries almost always condense into a single object powerful enough to make a larger story wobble. This sample is that kind of object. It turns Mars from scenery into evidence, from background planet into forensic planet, from red landscape into chemical archive. And once Mars becomes an archive, the entire tone changes. Archives are not alive, but they are not empty either. That distinction matters more than most viewers realize. Empty worlds feel emotionally finished. Archived worlds do not. An archive implies preservation, layering, incomplete access, things still waiting to be read correctly, and evidence that survives long after the system that produced it has vanished. That is exactly why this finding is so strong. It does not tell us ancient Mars was alive. It tells us ancient Mars may have preserved more of its chemical record than the public had been taught to imagine. That is the upgrade, from background planet to forensic planet. From dead scenery to unresolved evidence, from solved world to chemically unfinished world. NASA's caution makes that upgrade stronger, not weaker. The agency explicitly notes that organic molecules can be formed through non-biological processes. That matters, and any honest script has to respect it. But the caution does not drain the mystery, it sharpens it. A weaker storyteller rushes to certainty. A stronger storyteller lets the unresolved source do the work. Biological or geological, either path remains possible. Yet the chemistry has already become harder to ignore, and the diversity has already changed the tone. That is not a flaw in the story. That is the story. Because uncertainty, when the evidence underneath it grows richer, does not make the subject feel weaker. It makes the old explanation feel smaller. It exerts pressure. Not proof. Pressure. Pressure on the sentence that used to close Mars too quickly. Pressure on the habit of treating the planet as an emotionally solved object. Pressure on the assumption that whatever mattered there ended too long ago to leave behind chemistry worth narrating with this much care. Now the pressure is visible, and pressure is excellent for retention, because it gives the audience a real-time shift to feel. The viewer does not need a final verdict to stay hooked. The viewer only needs to sense that the previous verdict is taking damage. That is why this sample is stronger than 1,000 generic lines about ancient habitability. Habitability can sound abstract, distant, bureaucratic. One sample weakening the dead planet story feels immediate. It feels like a crack. And cracks make people lean in. This is where the script has to hard pivot. Because the deeper issue was never just whether organics existed. The deeper issue is that Mars keeps refusing to stay dead enough for the public story. That is the aggressive line, and it is the right one. Mars keeps refusing to stay dead enough, not in the crude sense of movie life. In the more unsettling sense that each better clue keeps forcing a more careful sentence. Ancient lakes, sedimentary layers, clay minerals, preserved compounds, environmental conditions that were once more supportive than people wanted to picture. Again and again, the planet resists the emotional flattening that made it easy to package. This sample belongs inside that resistance, and it may be one of the strongest versions of it yet. Because organics feel intimate, viewers hear organic molecules, and the subject changes temperature immediately. Rocks are one thing, organics are another. Even when people know perfectly well that organics can be non-biological, the phrase itself shifts the emotional field. It moves Mars closer to questions about history, preservation, and possibility in a way scenery never can. It makes the planet feel chemically inhabited by a past we have not read correctly yet. That is why this story outperforms a normal rover update. It does not merely say Curiosity found more information. It says Curiosity found chemistry that makes the old frame less comfortable, and discomfort is gold for a growth stage channel. Because it lets you ride proven demand without sounding derivative, the audience already knows how to click on Mars mystery. What they need now is a sharper promise. Not Mars is strange, too vague. Not life on Mars confirmed, too cheap. The stronger promise is this: one rock made the old Mars story weaker. That is specific, that is suspicious, that is trend adjacent, and it pays off. It also scales beautifully into a cluster. What exactly was in the sample? Why is diversity more powerful than one dramatic molecule? Why do new compounds matter more than viewers think? If organics survive this long, what else is the planet still preserving? If the source stays unresolved, does that make the mystery stronger instead of weaker? How should future missions approach a world that may be less chemically simple than the public narrative allowed? That is the real value of this topic. It opens doors instead of closing them. It builds follow-up gravity. And the human stakes are better than they first appear. Not because the result proves life and therefore turns every future Mars mission into a contact story. That would be lazy again. The stronger human angle is subtler and more believable. Future missions may be approaching a planet whose buried record is easier to disturb, contaminate, misread, or oversimplify than the public story prepared them for. That matters. It matters for where humans drill. It matters for what they protect. It matters for how they interpret ambiguous chemistry. It matters for how quickly they declare a place understood just because they have landed on it. In other words, this is not only about what Mars was. It is about how badly humans may want Mars to be simpler than it is. That is another hard pivot the script needs. Because the most dangerous thing about a world like Mars is not only what it contains. It is what people are eager to conclude about it too early. A dead world is easy to manage emotionally. A chemically unresolved archive is not. An empty desert lets you treat the planet like stage design. A preserved record forces humility. It forces slower sentences. It forces the audience to understand that exploration is not just about reaching a destination. It is also about avoiding the arrogance of thinking the destination has already been summarized correctly. That is why the sample feels heavier than it looks. It is not visually dramatic, but conceptually, it attacks the closure people were relying on. And closure is exactly what strong channels should destabilize, because destabilization keeps viewers moving through a video. They do not need total proof. They need a strong reason to feel that the previous emotional arrangement of the subject is no longer secure. This sample gives exactly that. It takes a planet that had begun to feel narratively safe and makes it narratively active again. That is a serious upgrade. NASA's own language points directly toward it. The agency says the discovery renewed confirmation that ancient Mars had the right chemistry to support life, and that the molecules join a growing list of compounds known to survive despite long exposure to radiation that should gradually break them down. The implication is not that Mars has confessed. The implication is that Mars has preserved. And preservation is precisely what keeps a dead world story from staying dead. NASA's release deepens that feeling by pointing to what some of the newly identified structures imply. Among them was a nitrogen heterocycle, a ring-shaped structure containing carbon and nitrogen, the kind of molecular architecture considered a precursor to RNA and DNA. NASA was careful not to overstate that point, but the implication is obvious enough to sharpen the mood. Mars is not handing us a biological confession. It is handing us chemistry that keeps brushing against the edge of the question in ways the dead planet shorthand cannot comfortably absorb. That is why this topic needs to be told as a narrative conflict, not a lab report. The conflict is not between truth and hype. It is between evidence and an old emotional frame that evidence is slowly outgrowing. Once you tell the story that way, every detail gets heavier. The sample came from a clay-rich region formed when lakes and streams existed there billions of years ago. Clay matters because clay preserves. Preservation matters because preservation is the enemy of easy dismissal. If Mars were truly only a beautiful ruin, then every new mission would mostly be a matter of refining scenery and filling in geologic blanks. But if some of the planet's more ancient chemistry can still survive long enough to be recovered, then Mars begins to look less like a stage after the play, and more like a library after the fire. Damaged, incomplete, but still holding enough to change what people thought had already been lost. And once that shift happens, the role of curiosity changes too. The rover stops feeling like a tourist taking picturesque samples from a dead desert. It starts feeling like a reader inside a damaged archive, lifting fragments from a record that keeps refusing to collapse into one clean sentence. That is a much stronger identity for the mission. It also gives this channel a better lane to exploit because it turns Mars content away from generic science-happened videos and into evidence-driven mystery. That evidence-driven tone is exactly why this video can track with competitor demand without feeling like a copy. Competitors win when they find an official clue, isolate one contradiction, and then build a larger narrative around why the old public story now feels thinner. That is exactly what this sample allows. The official clue is the molecular diversity. The contradiction is that a supposedly dead world keeps preserving richer chemistry than the emotional summary allows. The larger narrative is that Mars may be less simple, less closed, and less finished than people wanted it to be. This is where the script should hard pivot again, because the strongest part of the story is not even the molecules alone. It is the mismatch between how carefully NASA is speaking and how much emotional damage the finding does anyway. Officially, the source remains unknown. Officially, organics can come from life or from geology. Officially, the result reinforces that ancient Mars had the right chemistry to support life. All of that is careful language, yet the feeling the audience is left with is far less careful in the best possible way. Mars may not be the chemically simple graveyard they were taught to picture. A weaker script would run away from the unresolved source and try to compensate with drama. This one should do the opposite. It should lean harder into the unresolved source, because unresolved source is what makes the old story bleed. If the chemistry were fully explained and neatly geological, the emotional impact would shrink. If it were fully explained and neatly biological, the mystery would collapse into one sensational claim. The present state is more valuable than either shortcut. The evidence is stronger. The answer is not closed. The old story gets weaker. That is perfect tension. It also makes the future feel heavier. Because the more Mars preserves, the less casual future contact with Mars can remain. This is not about telling viewers astronauts will instantly destroy the truth. It is about forcing them to feel that exploration is also interpretation, and interpretation gets riskier when the archive is richer than expected. Where do you land? What do you drill? What do you contaminate merely by being there? How much of Mars has been emotionally written off because the instruments were younger, the samples fewer, and the culture too eager for simple endings? Those are hard questions. They are also bingeable questions, and they all grow naturally out of the same core line. One sample made Mars harder to dismiss. The audience should never lose sight of that because it is what makes the whole story feel grounded rather than inflated. You are not asking them to believe in cosmic speculation. You are asking them to look at a specific sample and notice that even NASA's careful wording now leaves less room for the old emotional closure than before. That is an honest, dangerous kind of persuasion. By the time the script reaches its last turn, the viewer should feel something very specific. Not that Mars has revealed life, but that Mars has stopped cooperating with the version of itself that felt easiest to package. But now it sounds worn out, premature, like a sentence that survived mostly because it was convenient, not because it was strong enough for the newest evidence. That is what good Mars content should do. It should not merely reveal facts. It should reveal which old sentences those facts are no longer strong enough to support. And this sample has done exactly that. One rock did not solve Mars. It weakened the story we used to close it. So no, the rock did not solve Mars. That would have been easier. What it did instead was more corrosive to the old story. It made Mars less dismissible, less easy to summarize, less emotionally closed. It forced a more careful sentence. It forced the viewer to feel that chemistry, not scenery, may be where the next important shift in the Mars narrative comes from. That is why this matters now. Not because Mars is alive, because Mars just stopped looking dead enough. That is the closing line the audience should leave with. Not because it screams, because it lingers, because it sounds like a verdict delivered after evidence, not excitement, because it tells the truth without pretending to finish it, and because it opens exactly the right after-image. If one sample can weaken the old story this much, what happens when the next mission reaches deeper, keeps cleaner samples, and asks better questions than the last one did? That is how you turn one rock into a trend. That is how you turn a chemistry finding into documentary force. And that is why this script should not end with a proof headline. It should end with the wound in the old narrative still open. Mars did not come back to life. It did something more unsettling. It stopped looking dead enough.